She stood in black and gold, silent as death. The Duke, who mocked her as worthless, now knelt before her. She owned everything he'd ever had. The spring of 1819 had been the season of Regina E. Reyes's greatest hope and cruelest destruction. She was a woman of respectable but unremarkable means, yet possessed of striking beauty. Auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, intelligent hazel eyes that missed nothing, and a grace that suggested she belonged in grander circles than birth had granted her. Thomas K. Hauser, Duke of Thornwick, had pursued her relentlessly that season, a man whose title commanded respect and whose charm could make any woman believe in fairy tales. For 8 months, Regina allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope, believing that Thomas valued her mind, her spirit, her character over the size of her dowry. She was a foolish woman to believe him. When the Ashford ball arrived in late spring, Thomas's devotion revealed itself as performance. He informed Regina, in a ballroom crowded with 300 witnesses, that circumstances had changed, that he must think of his family's legacy, that surely she understood. He announced his engagement to Lady Arabella Fitzroy, daughter of an earl with connections to the crown, and called Regina a pleasant distraction, nothing more. Then came the words that would echo through London's drawing rooms for weeks. Worthless in her poverty, presumptuous in her aspirations. The message was clear to everyone present. Regina E. Reyes was not enough. She was poor, unremarkable, and easily discarded. Regina said nothing. She simply walked from the ballroom with her head high, while society tore her reputation to shreds behind her retreating figure. 3 years later, Regina had rebuilt herself from the ashes of that humiliation. She no longer believed in the delusion of love transcending station. She sought only what was real: power, security, and a position that no one could strip away with mere words. She had learned her lesson well, or so Thomas believed. The invitation arrived on a cold January morning in 1823, delivered by a messenger whose livery bore the crest of the Marquis of Blackwood. The season's most exclusive event, the Blackwood Ball, and Regina E. Reyes, now known in financial circles as Mrs. R. E. Blackwood, had received not merely an invitation but a place of honor among the guests. When her carriage arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, London society understood immediately why bankers whispered her name with reverence and why men of business sought her counsel. She emerged in a gown of black silk and gold embroidery, the colors of power and mourning, with jewels at her throat that could purchase a small estate. Her entrance commanded the kind of silence usually reserved for royalty. She was no longer the hopeful girl Thomas had destroyed. She was something far more dangerous. Thomas K. Hauser stood near the center of the ballroom in his signature green velvet coat, his face draining of color as recognition dawned. His wife, Lady Arabella, looked unhappy and distant at his side. The advantageous match had brought neither love nor the promised political elevation. He had not thought of Regina in years, dismissing her as an embarrassing footnote in his history. Now she walked toward him with the measured grace of someone who held all the cards, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Your Grace," Regina said, her voice quiet yet carrying in the sudden hush. "How pleasant to see you again. I believe we have business to discuss." Thomas attempted a dismissive smile, but it faltered. Something in her eyes, a cold certainty, made his stomach turn. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Miss Reyes. What business could we possibly—" "Mrs. Blackwood, if you please," Regina corrected gently. "And the business is quite simple. I own your debts, Your Grace, all of them." She produced a leather portfolio from her reticule, slim and elegant. 70% of your obligations, to be precise. the mortgages on your secondary estates, the notes from your gambling losses, the investments that have failed so spectacularly these past 2 years. The color that had drained from Thomas's face did not return. His mind raced, grasping for explanations, for escape routes, for any reality other than the one she presented. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Mrs. Blackwood is— You can't be what, Your Grace?" Regina's smile was cold and precise. "Can't be the woman you called worthless. Can't be the girl you humiliated before all of London. Or can't be the financial power who now holds your entire future in her hands." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a tone only he could hear. "You taught me a valuable lesson 3 years ago. You showed me that in this world, only power matters, not love, not character, not promises. I learned that lesson very well." She paused, letting him see the documents bearing her seal. "Now I'd like to teach you one in return." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, to rage, to negotiate, to do anything that might restore his sense of control, but found no words adequate to the moment. Regina tilted her head slightly, studying him with the detached interest of someone examining a specimen. "I've arranged a private room. We have much to discuss about the terms of your future, Your Grace. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to have this conversation here, before all these witnesses." The parallel to his own cruelty 3 years ago was not lost on him. "Why?" Thomas managed finally, his pride crumbling into confusion. "Why go to such lengths?" Regina's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not satisfaction, but something colder and more complex. "Because you called me worthless, Your Grace," she said simply. "I wanted you to understand the price of that word." Regina E. Reyes arrived in London in February of 1819 with modest expectations and a wardrobe that had been carefully planned to stretch across an entire season. She was the daughter of a country gentleman whose estate provided respectability but little in the way of fortune, and she understood her position with clear-eyed pragmatism. A suitable match with a respectable gentleman would be success enough. She did not allow herself to dream of more. The city overwhelmed her at first, the crush of carriages, the grand townhouses that seemed to sneer at her family's rented lodgings in a respectable but unfashionable quarter, the glittering assembly rooms where fortunes and futures were decided over quadrilles and careful conversation. Regina possessed considerable intelligence and had been well educated by a father who valued learning over convention, but no amount of reading prepared one for the precise calibrations of London society. She first encountered Thomas K. Hauser, Duke of Thornwick, at a musicale in early March. He was everything the gossip papers promised. Devastatingly handsome, impeccably dressed, commanding attention merely by entering a room. Regina had not expected him to notice her at all, positioned as she was among the unmarried daughters of minor gentry. Her gown, pretty, but clearly not cut from the same costly cloth as those surrounding her. Yet he did notice. He requested an introduction. He asked her opinion on the performance they had just heard, and when she answered honestly rather than with practiced flattery, something shifted in his expression, a spark of genuine interest that made her breath catch. "How refreshing," he said, "to meet someone who thinks, rather than simply repeats what she believes others wish to hear." From that evening forward, Thomas pursued her with focused attention that seemed impossible to dismiss as mere flirtation. He appeared at gatherings where she would be present. He requested dances at balls where dozens of women with far greater fortunes and connections waited for his notice. He sent flowers, not ostentatious arrangements, but thoughtful selections that suggested he had paid attention to conversations about her preferences. He brought her books, engaged her in debates about politics and philosophy, and listened to her opinions as though they mattered. For 8 months, Regina allowed herself to believe in the impossible. Thomas wrote her poetry that spoke of souls recognizing each other across the artificial barriers of rank and fortune. He introduced her to his friends with evident pride. He spoke of a future where love mattered more than ledgers, where two people of genuine understanding could build something meaningful together. Society watched their courtship with fascination tinged with skepticism. The Duke of Thornwick, known for his arrogance and his keen awareness of his own consequence, pursuing a woman with neither title nor fortune. Some whispered that he had surprising depth of character. Others suggested he was merely amusing himself before settling into an appropriate match. Regina heard both varieties of gossip and chose to believe in what she saw in his eyes when he looked at her. Something that felt achingly real. She was, in the end, a foolish woman to trust what she saw. The Ashford Ball in late May was the pinnacle of the season, an event where invitations were treasured and attendance marked one's place in society's upper echelons. Regina wore her finest gown, a pale blue silk that had taken her modest clothing budget entirely, but was worth it for such an occasion. She had allowed her maid to arrange her hair with particular care, weaving in ribbons that matched the dress. When Thomas arrived to escort her, his smile had seemed warm, though she noticed he was quieter than usual during the carriage ride. The ballroom blazed with candlelight reflected in hundreds of crystal chandeliers. 300 guests representing England's finest families filled the space with conversation and music. Regina felt Thomas's tension beside her as they entered. The way his hand at her elbow felt more like a grip than a gesture of affection, but she attributed it to the occasion's formality. She did not expect him to lead her to the center of the ballroom. She did not expect him to raise his voice so that conversations stilled and faces turned toward them in curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas announced, his tone carrying the practiced projection of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "I am pleased to share joyful news. I have the honor of announcing my engagement to Lady Arabella Fitzroy, daughter of the Earl of Pemberton." The words hung in the air, like something solid and sharp. Regina felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, though she remained standing through sheer force of will. Around them, gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as Lady Arabella, whom Regina had never met, who had arrived in London only 2 weeks prior, stepped forward in a gown of ivory silk, her smile triumphant. Thomas turned to Regina then, and what she saw in his eyes was worse than indifference. It was cold satisfaction. "Miss Reyes has been a pleasant distraction these past months," he continued, his voice conversational now, intimate in its cruelty. "But surely no one believed a Duke of Thornwick would marry a woman so utterly worthless in her poverty and presumptuous in her aspirations. I must think of my family's legacy, of suitable connections. I'm certain Miss Reyes understands her place now." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. 300 pairs of eyes fixed on Regina, waiting for tears, for protests, for the spectacle of a woman's heart breaking in public view. Regina gave them nothing. She met Thomas's gaze for one long moment, memorizing the casual cruelty in his expression, the way he clearly expected her to crumble. Then she turned, her spine straight and her head high, and walked through the parting crowd toward the ballroom doors. Each step felt like miles. Her face remained composed, though she could feel the heat of humiliation burning beneath her skin. Behind her, the whispers began immediately, a rising tide of gossip that would destroy her reputation more thoroughly than any direct assault. She must have thrown herself at him. Social climbing at its most pathetic. Foolish girl, believing a duke would marry so far beneath his station. A cautionary tale, really. Regina walked out into the night air, climbed into her family's modest carriage, and only then, in the privacy of darkness, did she allow her hands to shake. Regina left London 3 days after the Ashford ball and did not look back. Her father's country estate in Hertfordshire was modest, a manor house that had seen better decades, surrounded by adequate farmland that provided a gentleman's income but would never generate wealth. It was quiet, unremarkable, and exactly what Regina needed. London society expected protests. They anticipated desperate letters to Thomas, tearful appeals to mutual acquaintances, perhaps even a scandalous scene at some public venue. Women who had been humiliated as Regina had been typically fought back with whatever weapons remained to them. Accusations of breach of promise, claims of ruined reputations, dramatic displays designed to win sympathy, or at least force acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Regina gave them nothing. She simply vanished as though she had never existed at all. The silence was strategic, though born initially from shock. In the weeks following her return home, Regina barely spoke, barely ate, barely recognized the passage of days. Her mother worried. Her father, a quiet man who valued reason over sentiment, gave her space to recover. He had warned her, gently, that the Duke's attentions seemed too focused for comfort. She had not listened. The letter arrived in October, delivered by a London solicitor who seemed surprised to find Regina in such modest circumstances. Her maternal uncle, Samuel Worthing, a man she had met perhaps twice in her life, had died unexpectedly in Bristol. He had been involved in shipping, the trade that polite society considered barely respectable but which generated considerable wealth for those shrewd enough to navigate its complexities. Childless and widowed, he had left his entire fortune to Regina, his only niece. The sum was staggering, more than staggering. It was transformative. Along with the money came business partnerships in Bristol and Liverpool, connections to merchants and shipbuilders, warehouses full of goods, and a network of trade relationships that spanned continents. Regina read the solicitor's explanation 3 times, her hands steady on the papers. Then she asked a single question. What would I need to understand to manage this inheritance properly? The solicitor, expecting her to request an immediate sale or to defer all decisions to male relatives, blinked in surprise. Miss Reyes, these are complex business matters. Perhaps your father— My father is a gentleman farmer, Regina interrupted quietly. I am asking what I need to learn. What followed was an education more rigorous than any university could provide. Regina devoured books on finance, trade law, estate management, and maritime commerce. She corresponded with her uncle's business partners, asking questions that began as elementary and rapidly became sophisticated. She studied ledgers, analyzed shipping routes, learned the rhythms of markets and the mechanisms of credit and debt. While London society forgot her name or used it as a cautionary tale, Regina transformed herself into something they would never expect. She was no longer the hopeful girl who believed in love. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a woman who understood power and knew exactly how to wield it. By spring of 1820, Regina understood something that most of England's aristocracy never grasped. Money was not about what one spent, but what one controlled. The shipping business her uncle had left her was profitable, but it was merely the foundation. Regina began to build an empire. She started cautiously, investing in ventures her uncle's partners recommended: textile mills in Manchester, warehouses in Liverpool, shares in trading companies that moved goods between England and the East Indies. She attended meetings in Bristol dressed in modest widow's weeds, claiming to be Mrs. R.E. Blackwood, a ship owner's widow managing her late husband's affairs. The fiction was simple and believable, providing her the freedom to operate in business circles where unmarried women drew unwanted attention and speculation. The merchants and bankers she worked with quickly learned that Mrs. Blackwood was no ordinary widow seeking to preserve her husband's legacy. She asked incisive questions, understood risk assessment with remarkable clarity, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict which ventures would succeed and which would fail. Within 6 months, her reputation for financial brilliance began to spread through England's commercial networks. Regina discovered something fascinating during this period. The aristocracy, for all their pride and ancient titles, were drowning in debt. They borrowed to maintain appearances, to fund lifestyles their estates could no longer support, to gamble and build and compete with one another in displays of wealth that often existed only on credit. The networks of obligation were intricate and deliberately obscure. Gentlemen did not discuss their financial difficulties openly, and solicitors maintained careful discretion about who owed what to whom. But information could be purchased, and Regina learned to pay well for it. By 1821, she had begun acquiring debts, not openly, never in her own name, but through intermediaries and shell agreements that obscured the true holder of the obligations. A baronet, who had borrowed heavily to rebuild his London townhouse, found his notes purchased by a banking consortium. An earl, whose gambling debts had mounted, discovered that his various creditors had all sold their claims to an investment company registered in Bristol. None of them knew that Mrs. R.E. Blackwood controlled the consortium, owned the investment company, and was methodically building a web that connected dozens of England's finest families. Regina worked with absolute discretion. Her solicitors were well paid and utterly loyal. Her bankers appreciated her consistent profits and asked no inconvenient questions. She operated from her family's country estate, corresponding by letter and meeting face-to-face only when necessary, always maintaining the fiction of the grieving widow focused on preserving her late husband's business interests. She was patient, methodical, and utterly focused. Every property she acquired, every debt she purchased, every investment she made was chosen with care. She was not building wealth for its own sake, though her fortune grew substantially during these years. She was building something far more valuable, leverage over the class that had declared her worthless. And she had not forgotten Thomas K. Hauser, Duke of Thornwick. She had not forgotten a single word he had spoken that night at the Ashford ball. Thomas K. Hauser's marriage to Lady Arabella Fitzroy was celebrated with all the grandeur befitting a Duke of Thornwick. The wedding was a spectacle of wealth and connection, attended by cabinet ministers and members of the royal household. Thomas believed he had secured not just a wife but a pathway to greater political influence through his father-in-law's position at court. The reality proved disappointingly different. Lady Arabella was beautiful, accomplished, and utterly indifferent to her husband. She had married for title and position, securing the status of duchess. Thomas had married for advantage, and found he had purchased nothing but cold formality and separate bedrooms. They maintained appearances in public, the handsome duke and his elegant duchess, but their private lives intersected only when social obligation demanded it. Worse still, within a year of the marriage, the Earl of Pemberton fell spectacularly from favour at court. A political miscalculation involving trade negotiations and an ill-advised alliance left him marginalized, his influence evaporating overnight. The connections Thomas had counted on vanished, leaving him with a loveless marriage and no compensating advantage. Thomas responded as men of his class often did when faced with disappointment. He spent money. He invested in schemes that promised extraordinary returns, a canal project that never materialized, shares in a mining venture that produced only debt, partnerships with men whose charm exceeded their business acumen. He threw himself into expensive pursuits with the carelessness of someone who had never been denied anything. His stable expanded to accommodate horses that cost more than most families earned in a year. He gambled at the clubs with the desperate intensity of a man trying to prove something to himself, his losses mounting steadily. Most extravagantly, he commissioned a massive renovation of Thornwick's East Wing, a project that ballooned in cost as Thomas insisted on imported marble gilded fixtures and architectural flourishes that served no purpose beyond display. The work dragged on for months, hemorrhaging funds, while his stewards reported quietly that the estate's productive lands were being neglected, that tenants were struggling, that income was declining. Thomas ignored these warnings. A Duke of Thornwick did not concern himself with such mundane matters as balanced ledgers or agricultural management. That was what stewards were for, and if they claimed there were difficulties, well, one simply borrowed more. His name and title were worth more than any sum he could possibly owe. By late 1822, Thomas had borrowed from banks, from private lenders, from friends who were too polite to refuse a duke's request. He maintained the fiction of prosperity with desperate energy, hosting lavish dinners and appearing at every significant social event in clothing that cost more than it should. No one must know that beneath the polished surface, the Duke of Thornwick was drowning in obligations he could not meet. He rarely thought of Regina Reyes anymore. When her name did surface in his memory, it was with mild embarrassment, a youthful indiscretion, a woman who had foolishly believed herself worthy of more than she was. An unfortunate episode, best forgotten entirely. He had no idea she remembered everything. Regina received the first report on Thomas K. Hauser's financial situation in March of 1822. Her network of informants, solicitors, bankers, club stewards who were paid to notice and remember, had been gathering information for months. The portrait they painted was one of spectacular decline disguised by aristocratic pride. The Duke of Thornwick owed money to 17 different creditors. His gambling debts alone exceeded £15,000. The renovation of Thornwick's East Wing had cost 3 times the original estimate and remained unfinished. His investments in a canal scheme and a mining venture had both failed catastrophically. Most significantly, he had taken out mortgages on 2 of his secondary estates, properties that generated modest but reliable income, to fund his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain appearances. Regina read the report twice, her expression unchanged. Then she began to work. She moved with surgical precision, always through intermediaries. A banking consortium in Bristol quietly purchased Thomas's gambling debts from 3 separate clubs, consolidating them under management that Thomas believed to be simply a change in administrative handling. An investment company registered in Liverpool bought out the mortgages on his secondary estates, offering the original holders a slight premium that made the transaction attractive. The sellers never knew who ultimately controlled the company. Thomas's creditors were generally happy to sell. The Duke had become an increasingly troublesome debtor, his payments irregular, his promises vague. When someone offered to take these obligations off their hands at reasonable terms, most accepted with relief. By summer, Regina had acquired 40% of Thomas's total debt. She moved carefully, ensuring nothing appeared coordinated or suspicious. Each transaction seemed independent, the natural flow of commercial business. Thomas received letters informing him of changes in creditor management, standard notifications that required no response beyond continued payment. Payments he was increasingly unable to make. Regina then turned her attention to competition. She invested in a horse breeding operation specifically designed to undercut Thomas's stable business, offering better animals at lower prices to his usual buyers. She purchased shares in a rival's estate near Thornwick and funded improvements that made Thomas's neglected lands look shabby by comparison. Every move was calculated to drain his remaining sources of income while appearing to be nothing more than shrewd business practice. By autumn, her solicitor presented her with updated figures. Through various entities and shell agreements, Mrs. R.E. Blackwood controlled approximately 70% of the Duke of Thornwick's total obligations. His mortgages, his gambling debts, his business loans, even some of his personal notes to friends who had quietly sold them to a discreet buyer, all now led back to Regina. Thomas had no idea. The paperwork was deliberately complex, the ownership obscured through layers of legal entities. He knew only that his creditors were becoming less patient, that his options were narrowing, that the walls were slowly closing in. Regina sat in her study, looking at the documents that represented Thomas's future, and felt nothing resembling satisfaction yet. This was merely the foundation. The web was complete. Now it was time to let him see the spider at its center. Regina returned to London in January of 1823. Though the woman who arrived bore little resemblance to the girl who had fled nearly 4 years earlier. She took a townhouse in Mayfair, not the grandest address, but respectable and well-appointed, the sort of residence that suggested substantial wealth without vulgar ostentation. The household she established was efficient and precisely managed, staffed by servants who understood that their mistress valued discretion above all else. She introduced herself as Mrs. Regina E. Blackwood, a widow whose late husband had been involved in shipping and trade. The fiction was now so thoroughly constructed that it felt almost real. She had documents, references, a complete history that would satisfy any inquiry. Her wealth was obvious, and her business credentials impeccable. Bankers vouched for her financial acumen, merchants spoke of her fairness in dealings, solicitors praised her understanding of complex commercial matters. Regina began with smaller gatherings, intimate dinners hosted by merchants' wives, afternoon teas with women whose husbands worked in finance, musicales attended by the professional classes who existed in society's margins. She was gracious, well-spoken, and careful never to draw too much attention. Her gowns were expensive, but understated. Her jewelry was tasteful rather than ostentatious. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her observations were intelligent and measured. The whispers began immediately. Some recognized her despite the years and the transformation. Regina Reyes, the girl who had been humiliated by the Duke of Thornwick, now returned as a wealthy widow. The coincidence seemed too calculated. But others saw only Mrs. Blackwood, a woman of evident means and respectable connections, someone who might prove useful to know. The grudging respect came from her obvious competence. Men of business discovered she could discuss trade routes and investment strategies with sophisticated understanding. Women found her conversation engaging without being threatening. She had money, position, and knowledge, qualities that commanded attention even from those who might have preferred to dismiss her. The invitation arrived in late February, delivered on heavy cream paper with an elaborate seal. The Marquis of Blackwood, a distant maternal connection who had become an unlikely ally through business correspondence, was hosting the season's most exclusive ball. His invitation included a personal note expressing pleasure at welcoming Mrs. Blackwood to the event, along with a private postscript that read simply, "I believe we share certain interests regarding debts and obligations. Your attendance would be most appreciated." The Marquis, it seemed, was aware of more than he pretended. He had his own reasons for wanting to see certain arrogant aristocrats brought to account, and he recognized in Regina a kindred spirit, someone who understood that power came not from ancient titles, but from controlling what others needed. Regina held the invitation for a long moment, considering the symmetry. The Blackwood Ball, her adopted name on an event that would gather London's finest families, and Thomas K. Hauser, Duke of Thornwick, would certainly attend, desperate to maintain appearances despite his crumbling finances. It was time to complete what she had begun. Regina arrived at the Blackwood Ball precisely at 9 o'clock, when the event was full enough to make an entrance, but not so crowded that her appearance would be lost in the crush. She had chosen her gown with deliberate calculation, black silk with intricate gold embroidery that caught the candlelight with every movement. The colors spoke of power and mourning, wealth and restraint. At her throat hung a necklace of diamonds and gold that had cost more than many families' annual income, accompanied by matching earrings that swayed gently as she moved. The effect was immediate. Conversations faltered as she entered. Women assessed her gown with envy, barely concealed behind fans. Men straightened. noting the obvious wealth and wondering who this striking widow might be and whether she could prove useful to know. The Marquis of Blackwood greeted her personally, his smile knowing as he led her into the ballroom with the courtesy due to an honored guest. Thomas K. Hauser stood near the center of the room in his signature green velvet coat, though Regina noticed it looked slightly worn at the cuffs, a detail invisible to most, but telling to her educated eye. Lady Arabella stood beside him, beautiful and distant, her expression suggesting she wished to be anywhere else. Thomas's face carried the strain of the past year, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a tightness in his jaw that spoke of constant tension. He didn't recognize Regina immediately. His gaze passed over her, as it did most of the room's occupants, cataloguing faces with the automatic arrogance of someone accustomed to being noticed rather than doing the noticing. Then something made him look again, his eyes narrowing as familiarity tugged at memory without quite resolving into recognition. Regina crossed the ballroom toward him with unhurried grace. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing drama, though not yet understanding its nature. When she stopped before Thomas, close enough that he could see her face clearly in the candlelight, she watched the transformation occur in stages. Confusion first. Who was this wealthy woman approaching him so directly? Then the shock of recognition as features he had dismissed from memory suddenly aligned with the face before him. Finally, absolute horror as the impossible became undeniably real. "Your Grace," Regina said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough. "How pleasant to see you again. I believe we have business to discuss." Thomas's mouth opened but no words emerged. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with something approaching panic. "Perhaps somewhere more private," Regina suggested, gesturing toward the side chambers off the main ballroom. It was not truly a question. Thomas followed numbly as Regina led him to a small sitting room, closing the door behind them. The music and conversation faded to a distant murmur. They stood facing each other, the 4 years between the Ashford ball and this moment stretching between them like a vast chasm. "This is impossible," Thomas managed finally. You can't be." "Mrs. R. E. Blackwood," Regina completed calmly. She produced a leather portfolio from her reticule, setting it on the small table between them. "I believe you've received correspondence from various entities regarding your financial obligations. I thought it time we discussed them directly." Thomas stared at the portfolio as though it might contain a serpent. Regina opened the portfolio with deliberate slowness, spreading documents across the table between them. Mortgages, loan agreements, promissory notes, all bearing Thomas's signature, all now controlled by her through various entities that traced back to a single source. 70% of your total obligations," she said calmly. "I could call them due immediately. You would be forced to sell everything, the estates, the townhouse, even Thornwick itself might not cover what you owe. Your title would remain, but you would be left with nothing but a name and the memory of what you once possessed." Thomas's face cycled through emotions, shock, rage, disbelief. "This is extortion. You could what, Your Grace? Challenge me legally? These acquisitions are entirely legitimate. Contest them publicly. The scandal alone would destroy what remains of your credit." Regina's voice remained level, almost gentle. "Or you could listen to the alternative I'm offering." The fight drained from Thomas's posture. He sank into a chair, looking suddenly older than his years. "What do you want?" "First, a public acknowledgement. At the next appropriate gathering, you will correct the record of what occurred between us. You will admit that you pursued me dishonestly and discarded me cruelly, not because I was unworthy, but because you valued wealth and connection above character." Thomas flinched, but said nothing. "Second, You will cede management of your Hertfordshire estate, your most profitable remaining property, to my oversight. I will implement reforms you've been too proud to consider. Modern agricultural methods, fair tenant agreements, investments in infrastructure. You will see what competent management achieves. And third, Regina continued, you will use your title and your seat in Parliament to support legislative reforms benefiting merchants and working classes. Trade protections, labor regulations, educational improvements, causes you've spent your life disdaining. Why not just destroy me? Thomas asked bitterly. Isn't that what you want? Regina met his eyes steadily. I wanted you to understand the price of calling someone worthless, Your Grace. Destruction would be simple. Education requires more effort. Thomas agreed because he had no choice. Over the following months, he watched Regina transform his failing estate into a model of progressive management. Tenants who had struggled under neglect now thrived under fair agreements. Fields that had lain fallow became productive through modern techniques. Income increased while improving lives, a concept Thomas had never imagined possible. He attended parliamentary sessions where he found himself, incredibly, arguing for reforms he would once have mocked. He saw merchants and tradesmen not as lesser beings, but as the engine of England's actual prosperity. And he watched Regina navigate these circles with a competence and vision that made his own previous arrogance seem childish and wasteful. When he finally attempted a genuine apology months later, Regina received it with quiet acknowledgement. I appreciate your words, Your Grace, but understand my success was never about you. It was about proving to myself that worth comes from within, not from anyone else's validation. 5 years after the Ashford Ball, Regina E. Reyes, she had reclaimed her true name, stood as one of England's most respected financial minds and social reformers. Thomas K. Hauser had become a more genuine and useful member of society, humbled by consequences but better for them. They were not friends, but there was respect. Regina's legacy was not the duke she had brought low, but the woman she became when she refused to accept someone else's definition of her worth.